Good evening. My name is Moira Shori, and I'm the Executive Director of Zócalo Public Square. Welcome to our discussion on Can Humans Coexist with Monster Wildfires, presented in partnership with the Huntington-USC Institute on California and the West. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to each other. Everything we do is free, and everyone is welcome. We publish ideas journalism and convene events like the one we're watching today. Find out more on our website, zocalopublicsquare.org. Today's discussion on wildfires, human life, and the changing climate is moderated by Nathan Rott. As a national desk correspondent for NPR, Nathan covers the environment and the American West. He is also an experienced wildlands firefighter. Over to you, Nathan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Zócalo Public Square for tonight's discussion on a topic that's becoming increasingly relevant, not just here in the US, but around the world. That is, how do we humans coexist with monster wildfires? My name is Nate Rott, and usually I report on wildfire and the environment for NPR in the field or recording studios, or now the inside of my closet, because nothing dampens the sound quite like a bunch of unused collared shirts. But tonight, I'm thrilled to be here with all of you for a conversation with three brilliant people, our panelists for tonight's talk. First up, Fernanda Santos, a journalist, author, and professor of practice at Arizona State University's Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Fernanda was previously with the Phoenix Bureau chief at the New York Times, where she worked for 12 years, and she is the author of The Fire Line, the story of the Granite Mountain hotshots, a deeply reported book about the tragic Yarnell Hill fire in Arizona in 2013. Our next panelist is Theresa Gregor, a descendant of the Ipai Nation of Santa Isabel and the Yoami Nation, and an assistant professor in American Indian Studies at California State University, Long Beach. She was previously the executive director of the Intertribal Long-Term Recovery Foundation. Finally, our last panelist is Jared Dahl Aldern, a historical ecologist, educator, and fire practitioner, or firelighter. He has collaborated with and learned from Indigenous people throughout California on prescribed and cultural burns, and he is an affiliated research scholar at the Huntington-USC Institute on California and the West. Thank you, everyone, for joining us with this conversation tonight and taking the time, and let's get to it. All right, to start, I thought it might be helpful to give those watching or listening a bit of a status update on the current fire season, because it is mid-July, and this is not a typical year. There's this thing called the coronavirus. I don't know, you guys may have heard of it. And Fernanda, I thought we could start with you, since you happen to live in a place that has one of the earlier fire seasons in the West. What has fire season been like so far for people out on the front lines who are not only dealing with fire, but a pandemic as well?
It's great to be here, Nate. Thanks for the introduction. So Arizona not only is one of the earliest states in terms of fires, but it's also the state that has right now one of the worst records in terms of spread and positivity of tests in the pandemic. So while here in Phoenix, where I live, we're more concerned about staying home, staying away from people, keeping ourselves safe. There have been fires burning in the state. Some of the largest fires that have burned so far this year are here in Arizona. One near the Tucson in the southeastern part of the state and one in the north central part of the state. And both of these fires forced evacuations. Both of these fires threatened property. And both of these fires burned with many fire crews on the ground, trying to contain the spread to then minimize the damage, while also keeping in mind that there is a benefit to fire in the forest. So the challenge this year is that while in the past, all it took was there's a fire burning, once there is a need for a big response, a fire camp would spring up within a matter of hours in, let's say, an empty high school or, the county fairgrounds, with showers, with dining halls, with rooms full of fire people who are managing those fires close together, huddling over maps, talking on the radio, discussing all the actions for the day and trying to outsmart the fire to plan for the day ahead, fire and weather both together. This year, they had to do it very, very differently. They have had to do it very, very differently. They've had to keep in mind the fact that they have to stay distant. Camps no longer have the types of camaraderie that you would find in the dining halls, because while the crews could stay together because they're out there on the line fighting the fire together, they couldn't commingle with other crews. They couldn't sit, the Carson hotshots couldn't sit with, the Prescott hotshots and discuss strategy together, because they had to not only protect themselves, but also protect others in case they are infected, right? These days are many asymptomatic people walking around. So it's been a very different fire experience. And one other thing that feels very different is that the pandemic has been such big news here that while in summers past, everybody was talking about the fires, everybody was sort of tracking how things were happening. This year feels almost like it became sort of, not important. People aren't talking about it. They don't, unless they live in a town that has been evacuated, they might not even know that fires have happened and are still happening, not just here, but also all around the southwestern, United States.
Yeah, it's certainly not top of mind for people. There's a lot of other stuff going on.
Right.
Jared, I know you're in California, where there's an argument to be made that fire season never really has a start or an end. So far this year, the state has not seen any monster fires. I'm knocking on wood. But it is dealing with the resurgence in coronavirus cases, and I understand that's impacted some of the state's efforts to do prescribed fires, fuel mitigation. How is that impacting the readiness of crews there for the fires that are sure to come?
Yes, well, that's all very true, what you've just laid out, Nate. And, similar to what Fernanda was just speaking of in Arizona, there have been some smaller scale incidents. In fact, there are some happening right now in Fresno County, where I am, on the western side of the county, and also nearby in Madera County. And all of those changes that Fernanda was just speaking of are happening in those fire camps with changed procedures. And yes, it also affected, as you mentioned, in the spring. There was some inability on the part of agencies like the Forest Service and CAL FIRE here in California to accomplish all of the prescribed burning that they would have liked to. And another thing that I should, sort of mention or throw into this mix of the story is, in California, there's a dependence on inmate fire crews, which is sort of when I think about it, there's an intersection of the problems of wildfire and social injustice, really, or you think about the composition of those crews and the rates of incarceration for certain groups of people. And then COVID, because what's happened with COVID-19 is many of the facilities, the prisons, have gone on lockdown, or some of the inmates have been released early from their sentences. And so this is, it's having an effect on the availability of personnel, on the human resources. So it is fortunate, knocking on wood, that there haven't been any megafires or monster fires yet, but they're almost sure to come in California. And these challenges are having an effect, on crews facing even the smaller scale incidents that we're experiencing right now.
I know that issue of inmate fire crews and a shortage of people that are ready to be deployed to fire is a huge issue in California and a lot of the West. Theresa, I wanted to ask you briefly about the community, how communities are dealing with this, or how they will deal with this. At this point, we know that communities of color are being disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Communities of color are also disproportionately impacted by natural disasters. What are you going to be watching for this fire season as fires come closer to California communities that are also dealing with this pandemic?
Well, I think one of the major issues facing American Indian communities, which is the community that I predominantly serve, is again similar to the impacts that Fernanda and Jared were laying out. You know, our crews are already somewhat minimally staffed. Some reservation fire departments don't have even a full-time 24/7 unit. They have volunteers. And if you're already strapped to find enough personnel to staff and to respond, you know, COVID's just exacerbating that. The other issue too, I think, goes to Jared's point that not all the fuel projects for wildland urban interface were able to be completed, or if they were completed, it was just, you know, kind to prioritize the most vulnerable areas of tribal lands. I think going forward with COVID, you know, tribes have sovereignty. So many of the tribes in the state opted to open up their gaming facilities, which is the economic driver for most of those communities. And it's really imperative that those enterprises can stay open, but they're constantly weighing the cost, right? If people are coming in, if they can maintain the CDC guidelines for social distancing and prevent a surge within their own communities, of course, that would make it safer for their first responders to go out and do their job if they need to. As far as from the community perspective, I define community a bunch of different ways, but like the everyday tribal citizen or person that lives within tribal homelands in terms of their community, I think it's increasingly important that people are prepared. Governor Newsom, prior to COVID, announced the California Preparedness for All campaign, where he put a lot of funding into community organizations through California Volunteers. And some of that funding went to tribal organizations. The Intertribal Emergency Management Association took on a really big portion of trying to roll out a robust community emergency response training that reached all of the tribes from northern, central, and southern California. And they partnered with Listos, which is Spanish for ready, and the Listos program, so that we could really reach kind of the most vulnerable and sometimes underrepresented communities in need of preparedness training and resources. Unfortunately, with COVID, the robust trainings that were planned and all of the supplies and information that was developed to be distributed to the community, that's all kind of been pushed onto the back burner because you can't have 24 people in a classroom and outside doing hands-on community emergency response training. But listoscalifornia.org, you can still go online and people can look up their 5 steps for preparedness, and it's really, you know, basic. Get information, stay informed, have your bags ready, because unfortunately, just like COVID, it doesn't see any barriers, right, between race and class and demographics in our community, neither does a wildfire. And if you live near or even far from a community, we know with the winds that we experience in California, that fire can come knocking on your door in a matter of hours. So it's important to still have your bags packed, all your important information ready, and some sort of a plan in place. Again, taking extra precautions because of COVID, making sure you have masks, hand sanitizer, medicines, all of those things ready. And then also kind of the new thing is like a stay-at-home box too, right? So if you do have to evacuate and go anywhere else, what are you going to need with you to quarantine? Because you are going to be going out and putting yourself at risk. The other important aspect is to also, help your neighbors, know what's going on around you. Even though we're siloed and we're asked to stay inside, we can still stand, against the fence and ask how they're doing and check in and make sure that they have the same information that you do. So if you do have to evacuate or leave, you're gonna have a plan and you're gonna be ready. So those are the things that we're pushing out to the community that, like Fernanda said, it's not the fire season threats and risks aren't really making the headline news because that's being topped by COVID, which is, incredibly important for us to know and stay informed about. But I think as the summer heats up and warms up and we head into fall, especially in California when the Santa Ana winds will pick up, we need to be just as alert as ever. And if not more so, I think this year.
And I just want to, I'm sorry, Nate, but I just want to try a little something, because in this whole, preparation and focus on coronavirus, COVID, all of this kind of ramped up right as the training that the seasonal crews receive to be ready to fight fires during the quote unquote fire season, which we know, is sort of like a term that doesn't apply anymore. I don't know the answer to that, but I do recall when I was researching for my book, I did the basic, wildland firefighter training. We were in a classroom, 24 of us, shoulder to shoulder, working together. We were discussing fire, hearing from instructors in small spaces, and then doing the field training out in the open. But there was a lot of sort of huddle classroom conversation. So I don't know how much the situation we're living in the pandemic has affected or impacted the training and preparation of crews who would be or are at the ready right now to jump in when these fires burn in different parts of the West.
Yeah, it's a challenge. And I've done some reporting on the Forest Service already saying that they have shortages of seasonal firefighters. It's a challenge there. And so you add this on top of it, and it's a lot to think about. I want to shift gears a little bit. I know we could probably talk about the coronavirus all day, but I don't know if you guys are like me. I'm a little sick of hearing about the coronavirus, even if I can't stop listening to every story about it. So I want to talk about the term monster fire or megafires, which are becoming increasingly frequent here in the US and around the world, as we've seen in Australia, as we're seeing now in Siberia. Jared, you're our resident fire historian. How do the fires of today compare to what we've seen in this country historically?
Well, I think, Nate, you're hitting the key there when you talk about the increased frequency of monster wildfires or megafires, because megafires have long been a part of the landscape in terms of spatially massive fires. But they are, all the data from dendrochronologists, scientists who study the age of trees and when those fire scars were placed on the trees, to other folks who study old ecosystems and the history of ecosystems, indicate that megafires, for instance, in the Southwest United States, there were huge megafires in the year 1748. They've always been a part of the landscape, but they are getting more frequent, and because in most locations, because of changed vegetation structure conditions or fuel conditions, these fires are becoming more severe. So in other words, a fire in the past, for instance, in the 18th century that may have burned a large area, at the same time, it may have burned through without burning all of the trees or all of the vegetation in that area. It may have skipped around and left more islands of unburned vegetation than we see in many megafires today.
A patchwork of burnt and unburned.
Right, exactly. So fire behavior is changing, and of course the other thing that's happening is just continuing development in what fire managers and firefighters call the wildland-urban interface. So there's essentially more contact between developed areas and areas where these fires are igniting and burning, so that there's more chance of a catastrophe in terms of property damage and injuries or fatalities for people. So the trend, again, monster wildfires have always been with us, but they're becoming more frequent and more destructive.
Where I am right now in Montana is not terribly far from where the big burn was, the fires in 1910. So another example. So knowing that megafires, large fires are increasing in frequency, knowing that we just can't help but build in the wildland-urban interface, since the nature of fire is sort of evolving and changing, Fernanda, you've done a lot of reporting on how we fight fire. Is that evolving and changing too?
would like to say that yes. But, if you look at the tools that a hand crew uses, the firefighters who are on the ground digging fire line, which are trenches, not quite deep, but just a space where that they clearing that they create in the forest to slow the progress of a fire until the flames kind of don't have anything else to eat and peter out. These tools are pretty much the same that were used in the big burn that you mentioned, Nate, over in Wyoming, Montana, a century ago, almost. They are still using tools that a lot of us are familiar with because maybe you have a landscaper who comes to do your front yard and might use, the types of shovels and axes that wildland firefighters carry with them. They use electric saws, and that's still pretty much the way fires are fought. There is on TV, what we usually see is the image of the plane dropping fire retardant or helicopter dropping retardant on water. But really, it's down below on the ground where the crews are that the real job of fighting fires. I mean, it's all like little pieces of a puzzle, not little big pieces that work together, but the work on the ground remains pretty much the same. The idea is fire eats vegetation. Vegetation is and homes and whatever is on the way. Firefighters call it fuel. That's what keeps the fire going. And the idea for fire crews on the ground is to starve the fire. And they create these fire lines, which is almost like a very well-rehearsed ballet where each person on the crew has a role. And the one behind will build upon the task performed by the one in front of him or her. And they will create these openings in the forest so that when the flames get there, they kind of slow down because there's nothing else to burn there, right? And that is extremely dangerous work that hasn't really changed. In Yarnell in 2013, the fire where 19 firefighters died, one of the biggest issues was that they couldn't locate the crew. These days, we can do geolocation maps based on our cell phones, right? Our smartphones. People know where we are. Some countries are doing contact tracing with coronavirus, looking at your geolocation data on your phone. Yet, we still have a hard time tracking the exact location and movement of crews fighting fires. So there is definitely a disconnect between all the technological advances we've had and what we have provided these firefighters. And essentially, from my perspective as not a firefighter, but someone who studied fires and had to learn from them and about them for a book, and it sort of became obsessed with it. It's largely because we have this attitude about fire that we don't have with other natural phenomena. We don't try to fight a hurricane. We don't fight, an earthquake, a tsunami, right? We hide, we run to higher ground. But fire, we've historically, humans have had this very interesting relationship of dominance with fire. And I think because of that sort of almost ego trip that we're into as we try to fight fire, we still believe we can vanquish it. And because we do many times contain these fires and declare victory in that way and save the town, and that's what everybody focuses on. We believe that we can continue to send these crews out there without much concern about what it is that we could and should be doing differently to make sure that they're safe, because lives should always come first, right? But sadly, it's only when lives are lost that we start thinking about these things. So that's sort of a long answer to talk about, something that really, truly has not changed much. You do seasonal firefighting, right? I don't know if you still do, working for NPR, but you did.
In my more limber and youthful days, I did, but no longer.
But, the way you learned how to fight fire and fought fires in the several seasons that you worked as a seasonal firefighter is not much different than after firefighting, wildland firefighting became sort of like more professionalized, for lack of a better word, and it's not much different than what the new crews who were trained just this year learned to do to go out and fight fires this summer and in the coming months. So, we really haven't seen much of an evolution in that. And that's really dangerous.
So I want to talk about a relationship with fire in a second, and just the way that whole narrative that you just described about how we think about fire as a society and as people. But I do have one other tactic question, sort of, that I'd love to ask you, Theresa. I know that, like, I recently did some reporting on the fires in Australia. I've done a lot of reporting on fires in California, where there seems to be sort of a growing recognition that that Indigenous peoples in this country and other countries, Aboriginal people in Australia, dealt with fire, lived with fire in a maybe even a more productive way than we are right now. And I'm wondering, like, could you give me some examples of some of the tactics and how that relationship worked, and whether those would be applicable to the way that we manage fires today?
Well, I think that the answer to that question goes back to the point that Fernanda was making a moment ago about the sense of fear and dominance we have with fire. And it's one of those natural phenomenon that we tend to think as human beings that we can conquer. And so I think a lot of it stems from a cultural point of view for Native people, Indigenous people, not just here in the Americas, but like you mentioned, in Australia and other parts of the world, where fire was a tool and it was a gift. And so we've lost that relationship and that sense of stewardship really over it. I think Jared can also speak to this because he definitely is more progressed and advanced in his cultural recovery and revitalization efforts with fire. But for my work with our tribal communities and our ecological stewards, there is a growing partnership. I think it's stronger in Northern California and Central California than it is in the South because of our climate and our topography. But there is a growing partnership to revitalize cultural burnings so that we're actually looking at the trajectories and pathways of historical fires, the way they would approach a community, and burning appropriately. The Forest Service, when it was started, had a mission to suppress fires. But as Jared was talking about, climate change and the history and transformation of these megafires, in combination with population growth and more people moving out into these wildland urban interface zones, it really does create sort of a perfect storm, right, for catastrophe and danger. But the premise of cultural burnings is that if we can return to that traditional ecological knowledge and those practices and identify these spaces and places and actually start to steward the land, do a prescribed, it can still be called, the Forest Service and CAL FIRE would call it a prescribed burn. But we're doing it in a way that's identifying native plants that are useful not only for people, but for the animals, for the water, and for the other plants surrounding that space and that habitat. So it really takes a team, right, of specialists, community members, and today the firefighters. And I think if more of that traditional ecological knowledge or cultural knowledge was brought to bear in the trainings that Fernanda was saying to educate our wildland firefighters that are going out there on the line, I think it could really transform the way that we look at not just suppressing fires and putting them out, obviously to save lives and property, that's important, but to really change our relationship with the land, right? And so to look at it as, again, using fire as a tool, you have to put fire on the ground, as she was saying, to starve it in defense of the fire. And it can be used as a tool to actually revitalize the land. It can help retain more water. It can bring back animals to specific places that are overgrown. So I think looking, shifting the narrative to that, shifting our practices, I think can be really transformative. And these practices have been around for thousands of years, right? So it's not new knowledge, it's just reapplying it and kind of decolonizing this narrative and relationship that we have with fire.
Jared, could you explain, because I've done a lot of reporting on prescribed fire. I think most people sort of have heard the term prescribed fire, but is there a difference between cultural fire and prescribed fire? And if so, could you explain what that is? And could you explain, Theresa just did a lovely job of explaining how you can use fire as a tool, but are there other ways in the practices that you've done that you think might be interesting for people to hear?
Sure. Yes, I have had the honor and privilege of doing a little bit of collaboration with some cultural fire practitioners here in Central California. I've talked with Theresa and others in Southern California and have been able to learn to visit some prescribed and cultural fire events in northwestern California also. So I've been able to learn a little bit about, I guess I would characterize the differences in those terms as to draw on a little bit of history again, because that's the way I am. The prescribed fire is a term that came about in the agencies such as the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Forest Service when fire practice became becoming more professionalized. And so the idea of prescribing a fire means that there is a written prescription, and it's looking to the burn boss or the person who writes that prescription, writes that burn plan, as the professional. It's sort of, it's a direct analogy to a doctor writing a prescription to cure a patient, and it's Dr.
Fire.
It's right, exactly. And then you have objectives, you have written objectives, you have something that all the participants can look at, and it's it's part, as I say, of the professionalization of the practice and the attempt to become more careful and more exacting in your prescriptions. And the other thing I would say is that prescribed fire is most often focused on fuel hazard reduction. So you're going out to your prescription, your burn objective is going to include reducing the hazardous conditions by burning when conditions are right, when the weather conditions are right, for instance, so that you can contain the fire. And then later, when you have, say, 90 mile per hour Santa Ana winds, or high temperatures and extremely challenging fire conditions, and a fire does come through, it doesn't burn as severely because you did that prescribed fire, in the past when conditions were right for it and easier to control. So a cultural fire, as I've learned about cultural fire from practitioners, again, here in Central California, like Ron Good of the North Fork Mono tribe, with whom I've, had the great opportunity to work with and learn from. A cultural fire is not necessarily going to, it can involve a written prescription, but it's not necessarily going to involve a written prescription. It's as Theresa was just saying a few minutes ago, it draws on an archive of information that's not necessarily written down, but is time tested and, in many cases, thousands of years old. It can involve the idea of reducing the fire hazard or the danger, but in a cultural fire, there's most likely going to be other goals that the burners have, like enhancing certain kinds of plants, or increasing the diversity, the mixture of plants that you have in an area, or creating conditions that are better for certain animals' habitat. In many cases, I really, my ears perked up when Theresa mentioned that fire is a gift. It's not something to dominate, but it's, cultural fire practitioners may view themselves in a ceremonial context as offering a gift to the land, which may have its reciprocal return, again, in spiritual fulfillment, but also in some of these cultural resources like plants that are, better for food purposes or for basket making purposes, or to provide food for animals. It's a much kind of wider goal, I think, that your typical prescribed burn plan might be able to incorporate.
The idea being, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to that point, for California Indians, for the majority of us, we're acorn eaters up and down the coast from Southern California to Northern California. And using fire was really instrumental in the acorns drop. If you had the burn, done at the right seasonal moment and culturally prepared, then you would have a better harvest, because the smoke from the fire, the low burning fire, would actually deter pests from boring into the acorns and sort of ruining the harvest. And then it also clears away the mulch and the underbrush that can accumulate under the oak trees, so that then when they drop, they can actually, go into the ground, those that aren't picked up, and then reproduce, right? So in that way, it was really necessary for a major food staple, like I said, for thousands of years before the Spanish came and wanted to dominate and suppress our fire practices.
Theresa, I'm going to think of that acorn example later this summer if I'm choking on smoke at some point. I'm going to think it's not all bad.
It's not all bad.
How do we change the narrative? How do we change our relationship with fire? What you guys are describing is that fire is good in a way, and it's a part of the landscape. So how do we change our societal way of looking at it? Fernanda, maybe I'll ask you with that.
I'll give you an example of how, in looking at the way fires have interacted with communities and the land around these communities, you can see, you can take out the message that fire is tragic, or you can take out the message that fire can be helpful and good without necessarily harming the community. Yarnell, this small town here on the mountains in central Arizona, in 2013, as I mentioned earlier, there was this deadly fire where 19 firefighters of the same crew were killed. 19 hotshots. The fire burned the west side of town, started by lightning, very common this time of the year. It's monsoon season. So we get lightning and we get rain that evaporates before it hits the ground because the air is still super dry. So it's only now in July, although I haven't seen a single monsoon yet in Arizona. And this time I would have seen them here in Phoenix, but this time of the year, the air is more saturated with moisture. So you actually get the rain that, hit the ground. But anyway, in 2013, this fire in Yarnell burned the west side of town, killed these 19 firefighters. Out of control. There was no stopping it once the wind picked up and the monsoon winds picked up and literally pushed this fire that then fed on brush that had not burned in 40 years. And it was dry, given that the last rain that they had was in April, and it was negligible rain. So fast forward to 3 years later in 2016, obviously many times we learn our hardest lessons from the worst of tragedies, right? So the little town of Yarnell and its fire chief at the time decided to, working with the state of Arizona and federal agencies, to apply for grants. They are available, and the grants were used to create what's known as defensible space. So basically they carve out this buffer zone between the town and the wildlands, so that in case a fire burns, this fire line is already kind of built there. So the firefighters have a little bit of a wiggle room, and the people who live in that town are not immediately threatened because the wildlands don't end right on your front yard or backyard. There is a space in between. So there was this fire in 2016, very similar, on the east side of Yarnell, started by a lightning strike. Most people have not heard about it because guess what? Nothing happened. The lightning struck. Firefighters dispatched to the area. There was a command center set up, obviously very re-traumatizing to the residents there, to the families of the firefighters who died. But the fire did not damage a single building in town, did not cause anyone to be killed or seriously injured. And it was put out. And the reason it was put out is because the community realized that unless it prepares ahead of time, it's left really with no choice but to run away and let the fire burn everything, or risk killing, dying in the process. So the way to change the narrative is to, from the media's perspective, right, is to emphasize more of the stories of success, more of the stories where fire actually, the relationship between a community and fire crews and fire is one where everybody sort of worked together ahead of time and prepared to allow this force of nature to come and do its thing. We can't stop lightning from striking. We can't get more rain in the desert. Well, we wish we could, right? But what we can do is prepare. If you live in an area that is prone to burning, prepare ahead of time so that you let the fire burn the wildlands and create conditions that maybe in the future will allow for more acorns to sprout, for more trees to grow, for the ground to be clean so that you don't have these fires that climb to the tops of trees and then get out of control. So if we start each working ahead of time and giving fire its deference, then things won't be as tragic. But the first step to changing, not the first step, but one of the necessary steps to changing the narrative is to highlight more of the stories where things worked out. Not just look at wildfires when something goes horribly wrong, but also look at when things go right and why did they go right and how can we replicate those behaviors so that we have more stories of fires going quote unquote right than quote unquote wrong.
That criticism is one I hear frequently from fire ecologists and I'm sure Theresa and Jared, you guys feel this way. It's the way that the media tends to cover wildfires, that when it gets big and it gets bad, people come in and cover it.
And sadly, if I may add, Nate, sadly, as someone who has worked as a journalist for 20 some years now, it's not as sexy a story, right? People would much rather read about Paradise in California being, completely decimated by a fire and the sadness that it came and maybe the heroic stories of people saving their neighbors. Then they want to read about, hey, there was another fire in this town called Yarnell and look, they did everything right and nothing happened, right? Because nothing happened. What's the story? But we have
doesn't have the same tension, the good versus evil. Yeah.
But I think that is sort of like a small way of thinking about the way we cover things in general and we consume news in general. We're always looking for the bad outcomes. What about focusing on the positive outcomes? And that can be translated to everything. The way, there are horrible examples of how police mistreat people. What are the good examples too, so we can learn from these practices? It's the same with fire. There are many, many examples year after year of communities that prepared ahead of time and didn't burn. But we don't focus on those because people are not quite, and editors, frankly, are not really that interested.
So that is the perfect segue to the last question I want to ask before we get to Q&A. And it's going to be kind of a lightning round because I want to hear Jared and Theresa if you guys have a suggestion here. All right. So I don't really need to tell you that there's a lot of anxiety in the world right now. The idea of monster fires on top of a pandemic, on top of social injustices that we're all kind of seeing and living with right now is absolutely terrifying to me as a journalist and as a human. But is there anything that you look at right now that's happening that gives you hope for the future? Theresa, how about you start?
Wow. I think every day I still try to wake up with a heart full of gratitude that I do have my health, that I have a job, that I can still help my community. We were talking about earlier the training that the fire departments weren't able to do, but all of our tribal emergency responders have stepped up to be points of distribution for PPEs for their community. And our organization, the Intertribal Long-Term Recovery Foundation, worked to get over 150,000 masks delivered so they can go out to all of Southern California tribes, gowns, shields. We partnered with FEMA and Cal OES and had to set it all up virtually, right? So people could come in at different times and do drive-by pickups. So I think I still am hopeful about humanity. In the good in humanity, to go to Fernanda's point, that we do need to look at the positive and look at cooperation and collaboration and our relationships with one another in order to be prepared, right? To bolster ourselves against things that are out of our control, right? We can't control the pandemic. We're trying really hard, practicing social distancing and doing our part. But I really like her point, and I think this is a key mantra for disaster preparedness, right? Is that an ounce of prevention is worth Am I saying it right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of, I'm getting it wrong.
Pound of cure, you nailed it.
A pound of cure. Thank you. I needed that. And so I think, you kind of have to stay positive. I mean, otherwise you really are just going to be sort of a nihilist, right? And think like, oh, the world's caving in on me. And you're like a Chicken Little running around, the sky is falling all the time. I see hope with partnerships. Every time there is a major mega fire, we learn more about, again, what we coulda, shoulda, would have done. But then we, in California at least, and in Southern California, we actually look at those lessons learned really hard. And we strive to improve our communications, our response, our tools, our strategies. I was mentioning earlier to Jared when we were speaking before the session started that, San Diego Gas and Electric, it's a part of the big infrastructure of our, utilities in the state. But after the 03, 05, 07 wildfires in San Diego County, they installed anemometers on all of their infrastructure throughout the county, and they're the largest weather station in the nation. They've used that technology to measure fuel, to measure temperature, to measure wind speed so that they can have prescribed power shutoffs. That's not a sexy, easy choice to make because especially in the middle of summer or late fall when we're having extreme heat, but the shutoffs are strategic and they're getting better all the time at shutting them off just only for a short period of time so that fire danger won't ignite one of their lines and then, perhaps endanger a community and have to risk evacuations. So I think, we can learn together. We have to learn to live in the places that we inhabit. We have to build relationships and connections, not just with human beings and technology, but also the landscape and ecology around us. And I think if we can take those lessons to heart, there's hope.
Jared, are you a hopeful guy?
I am hopeful, and listening to both Fernanda and Theresa just now, and thinking about the idea that successes aren't often celebrated, and that's because nothing happens. So how do you write a story about that? But part of that story, if we could write it more often, I think would be partnerships and relationships among agencies and communities. And, just really quickly, I've been thinking lately about, it's a piece of jargon that's been making the rounds in fire circles, which is potential operational delineations, meaning, fire planners or fire managers are looking at potential places to do prescribed fire and implement fuel breaks, fuel treatments. So they look like potential operation delineations. The acronym is POD. They look like little pods on the landscape. But what you can maybe start to do with that is work with the local community and that local knowledge, so that you're not only working on reducing fire hazard, but thinking, what is our relationship with the landscape within this pod, and how can we work with the land, for instance, to get more surface water into streams, utilizing that idea of maybe using cultural fire, and just a couple last thoughts that I'll leave off with would be, what we really need to do is change that relationship with fire, or transform our idea of what fire is, instead of an enemy or evil or something to dominate. And I think there is an analogy to floods. Yes, floods can be very destructive when they come through, but if you plan ahead and maybe build a little basin, you can use that flood water to do some good things. To grow some good crops. So, back to the idea of islands within a megafire or a monster fire, maybe you could start to design things so that you end up with an archipelago of islands that a fire can burn through or flow around in the way that water would flow. Start to think of it more as a flowing source of energy rather than simply a destructive force. The only other thing I'd add is, I think in the southeastern US right now, there's some great examples of communities coming together and doing a lot of community-based prescribed fire, for instance, together, working together. And they're also having things, they're calling them fire festivals, to come together and celebrate, learn together, have learning exchanges, but also have fun together and learn that fire can be a positive force and something that you can work with rather than only something to fear and fight.
That's very cool, but they should probably rebrand because the last fire festival didn't go so hot.
That's true. Yeah.
And remind me, so POD, what is that acronym for again?
Potential operational delineations. So they're delineating on maps potential areas to fight the head of a fire, but also delineating, fire breaks. So they look like they're enclosing certain areas into pods.
That's very cool. Leave it to the Forest Service to make a very cool idea sound very boring, right?
Exactly.
All right, I want to get to the Q&A section because we've got some great questions coming in. And one of them is one that it's a brilliant question. I'm actually really interested in this. Given the fact that the wildland-urban interface is one of the most rapidly developing places in the United States right now, is there a way for us to build in the wildland-urban interface that mitigates fire risk? And should people that build in the wildland-urban interface have to pay to help mitigate those risks?
I can take that on somewhat. Well, in California, Fernanda, you were mentioning Yarnell, the fire that burned on the eastern side of the town, that they invested in doing the fire break and defensible space for the homeowners. That's pretty much standard CAL FIRE protocol for anybody that lives in the WUI areas, the wildland urban interface areas. If they drive by and see that you don't have 50, 100 feet of defensible space, you could be ticketed or fined. Wow. And so a lot of community organizations work, like our organization, a lot of the CERT programs, fire safe councils in San Diego, Southern California, work to create opportunities for homeowners to maintain and manage that defensible space by having chipping days, right? Debris removal days. People will join together and volunteers will come and, help you clean your house and clear that debris away. But I think one of the projects that we're working on right now, and I think this would be useful for homeowners that live in areas with recurring fires, and every year there might be the lightning strike or there's going to be the Santa Ana winds, and there could be a rogue ember and a mega fire could start. We're working with 2 tribal fire departments, the La Jolla Reservation Fire, who experienced a 90% burned land with the 2007 Pumacha fire, and the San Pasqual Fire Department. We're working with Valley Center and Palomar communities, which are neighboring towns to those reservations, to find a program to give every homeowner, or at least right now, maybe to pilot it, like elders and people with access and functional needs, a fire blocking gel. So when they do have to evacuate, that's the sort of last ditch effort that they can spray down their home. You could use your garden hose to attach it to this package and spray down your home, and it would give it an extra chance as you evacuate and leave. It's been proven to work. Some of the neighboring communities have already received county funds to distribute these to homeowners. But the tribes are not excluded because of jurisdiction, are not included in that grant because of jurisdictional issues. So we're currently working to craft a grant proposal with some of our donors to get enough gel for about 300 homes to pilot it and see if we can save some property. So I think yes and no is my answer to that question. Okay. Yes, you need to take responsibility, and yes, you're going to need to pay for it. But I think there's cooperative ways that you can work with your government and community organizations to subsidize those costs.
And one thing that I think is important in that, and I'll make it quick, is that when you build in the wildland urban interface, and I'm talking more about these more upscale developments, $1 million homes. Everybody, lots of people dream retirement home is that home that overlooks a forest or a beach, right? So when you build there, and in Arizona is very common, homeowners associations fees, part of that is used to pay for the mitigation in the off season. So they will hire, say, an inmate crew to come and trim the trees and and clear the forest floor around and so forth. But I think that there has to be an understanding from the part of the homeowner that once you build a home in the interface, there is a risk that you will lose that home. You can never expect, I think some of the biggest tragedies happen because there's so much pressure from the community. And the more upscale or affluent the community, the more the pressure comes from higher ups because they have connections to the governor, the senator, to put another crew out there, get other people to put out this fire because it's going to destroy, these homes. I think there has to be an understanding that it's an accepted risk. You're going to buy this house, you're going to build it, it's going to be beautiful, and you're going to invest part of your money to take care of that space to hopefully never have to lose your home to a fire. But it is possible that it will happen. And it has to be accepted so that we don't collectively put the pressure on the young men and women who are on the fire lines to put themselves at risk and then have things such as what happened in Yarnell happen again.
I would just add to that for tribal communities, our reservations were the last bit of our ancestral territories if we were lucky that we're assigned. And so we don't necessarily have the luxury of saying we built this house here and we want to be, we want to be here, we were placed there. And for many community members, they don't want to leave, but these increasing risks because of climate change make it really deadly for them to stay. And so the interface, we just call that the reservation. We just call that the backcountry. And it's a term that has come up lately. And we've really had to do a lot of education and outreach to our members to say, you do have some responsibility in this, even though your family didn't choose to be here, because these threats are real and they're coming with more frequency. So that's just one distinction I like to say. And then that's our homeland. If it burns, we can't move and go anywhere else. We have to go back and rebuild.
That's a really good point, because I know that the conversation, especially with climate change, of managed retreat, of actively planning to vacate areas that people live now because of a changing climate, that severely complicates it. The idea of relocation for different people in this country means very different things and has a long historical context. So I have a question here that came in. Are the powers that be, and that's in quotes, actually committed to the well-known prevention measures needed to prevent megafires from happening? Jared, do you feel strongly about that? Putting you on the spot, bud.
Well, that's it's a great question. I certainly can't speak for the powers that be. It will. It's going to take a lot of broad-based, community-based work and labors of love together to transform the landscape and transform communities' relationships with fire. So it's difficult to answer the question in the sense that, as I was speaking of earlier, megafires have always been with us. And you're not necessarily going to prevent a large fire from happening, but you can certainly create the conditions where you don't have the destruction from a monster wildfire that we've seen recently. And that might mean a community, even an urban community, going out into to use quotes again, quote unquote, wildlands, to work with that land and create the conditions so that you have fires that burn through certain areas without picking up a lot of momentum and burning in heavy fuel areas, even out in what might seem like remote areas of a forest, for instance. So you start thinking of, here in Fresno County, say in the city of Fresno, it might do well for all of the people here, the powers that be, or for all of the people to push the powers to be, to think of the forest in the Sierra Nevada as part of our home. in the way that maybe Indigenous people think, not just of homes or houses, but of a homeland. So there are benefits to going out and working with the land in terms of water quality and smoke reduction, because everyone, for instance, here in the Central Valley in California has a lot of experience with heavy smoke from megafires in the past decade. So how can you create conditions, maybe by having smaller prescribed fires, a series of smaller prescribed fires, so that you choose to get a little bit of smoke spaced out over time, rather than a hugely hazardous amount of smoke during a wildfire event. So there's a lot of work that could be done, and that we could push the powers that be toward. That's what we have to do is tell the powers what they ought to be doing.
There's a brilliant fire ecologist here that I've interviewed in Missoula at the Montana Fire Lab a couple of times, who's basically said that, you can't choose if we want fires, but we can choose when we want them. Do we want small ones that are manageable, or do we want these big mega monster fires that are nearly impossible to contain or corral? And that's always something I think about when we enter a fire season. All right, we've got time for about one or two more questions. And so as an educator, where can I find information about Native peoples who dealt with fire? And I didn't know that smoke from fire would keep insects from boring into trees. Neither did I. So great question.
Well, I would start, I can speak to California, and Jared, you can probably add on to this list, but I think the most recent book to gain a lot of attention is M. Cat Anderson's Tending the Wild, which really provides an in-depth ecological and historical look at the stewardship of the land that the California Indians practiced. And one of the pieces of that book, talks in great deal about the use of fire as a tool. My mind's blanking, but there are books that preceded her as well. Jared, you might want to go. There's the Indigenous Peoples Burn Network. They're an online resource that you can utilize. Even if you read accounts from Florence Shipbeck in San Diego County, her book Pushed into the Rocks, she talked about the way that, Southern California tribal community members were really stewards. They weren't just occupants of the land, right? We weren't just sort of mindlessly wandering around, that we actually cultivated the land and watched over it and cared for it. But you can find my contact information, and I could give you a more in-depth bibliography. But Jared, if anything pops off the top of your head, you can jump in.
You mentioned some great sources, Theresa, for educators. I'll say you can also, Google my information up and look at my website, where I have one of the links that I have on the front page there of the website is to a curriculum that Ron Good of the North Fork Mono Tribe and I wrote a few years ago, and it's now housed on the web along with lessons from many other regions, and it includes some fire lessons, some lessons on Indigenous fire. It's through an organization called the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. There's also, as Theresa mentioned, down in San Diego, there are some educational resources that you could find regarding Kumeyaay fire in terms of lessons from, I believe it's the Kumeyaay Degano Land Conservancy. I don't know if there would be a way for us to provide links in the recording that's going to be made of this event or not, but they're out there if you look for them, and I can help you look for them if you want to contact me.
Look for a lot of people sliding into your DMs later, Theresa and Jared.
Yeah.
Well, that's about all the time we have. That's the last question I think we're going to be able to take tonight. This video will be published on Zócalo's site, zocalopublicsquare.org. Again, that is zocalopublicsquare.org. And as a podcast, because I know everybody's listening to podcasts now. You can read a summary of this discussion on the website, along with interviews with tonight's panelists. Thank you again to all of our panelists tonight: Fernanda Santos, Theresa Gregor, Jared Dahl Aldern, for joining this conversation, and to the Huntington-USC Institute on California in the West for co-presenting tonight's event. Lastly, I just want to say thank you to all of you that were listening and joining us during these strange and sad times. Please be well, take care of yourselves and others, and be safe. Good night.